So if you didn't think Republicans really are that bad, check out these statements that they've made where they essentially say the quiet parts out loud. Let's talk about it in today's video.
So you would be okay with the Supreme Court leaving the question of interracial marriage to the states?
Yes, I think that that's something that if you're not wanting the Supreme Court to weigh in on issues like that, you're not going to be able to have your cake and eat it too. I think that's hypocritical.
Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to give you the ammo you need to stand up to the MAGA crowd and their BS. What you just saw is an interview with Indiana Republican Senator Mike Braun, where he essentially says that the Supreme Court was wrong to stop states from banning interracial marriage. The Loving v. Virginia case is the case that they were talking about at the time, and it was dramatized in the wonderful movie Loving, which really shows what this interracial couple went through. Americans as a whole, since about the mid-1990s, have essentially, by a majority, approved of the idea that it's okay for relatives of theirs to marry people of different races. So even though the Loving v. Virginia decision was handed down in the early 1960s, it wasn't really until about 30 years later that public opinion followed along. And again, now, most Americans really don't have any issue with interracial marriage. But the people who do, now they're a substantial minority, and they're a group who make up a big part of the Republican base. Again, these are the people who essentially want to assert that America is a white Christian nation, that everybody else should be subservient to them. Interracial marriage offends their sensibilities because of the fact that it amounts to race mixing or essentially replacing white people. There's this idea of white replacement theory, which Tucker Carlson on Fox News has made a big deal out of. The idea that white people are being replaced by people of color, both through immigration and through marriage. This is not some minor issue to the conservative Christian right-wingers. In fact, the genesis of the anti-abortion movement, interestingly enough, was the effort to fight in order to integrate conservative Christian university Bob Jones University. In other words, the genesis of this anti-abortion movement was really one to continue the conservative white Christian supremacy. Now, given the fact that that opinion is increasingly unpopular among Americans, especially as most families now have relatives who've either married someone of color or who are in a relationship with someone of color, so it becomes pretty hard at that point to say that you're opposed to those type of relationships. So Republicans instead have relied upon what they call dog whistles, which are basically ways to talk about race without seeming like you're talking about race. Obviously, the anti-abortion movement is one example of this, although I would admit it's gone well beyond its segregationist roots. But certainly the arguments against crime, the drug war, and the Blue Lives Matter movements are all driven almost entirely by racism, even though they try to couch them in non-racist language. That fact was evidenced in the recent Ketanji Brown Jackson Supreme Court confirmation hearings. I'll get more to that later. So Senator Mike Braun admitting the fact that the Republican position is actually one that wants to undo the protections that exist for interracial marriage is actually a very telling one and really shows what the conservatives have in mind for America. The irony, though, is he actually has a point. It's the opposite point than the one he intended. The point is this, that there's this idea of substantive due process, something you might have heard discussed in the Braun hearings, which argues that typically where the due process requirements of the Constitution that exist within the body of the Constitution, as well as the 5th and the 14th Amendments, and basically say that you can't be subjected to a decision by a legal process unless you've had the opportunity to essentially make your case in that process. That's what due process is. Or at least that's what procedural due process is. What substantive due process says is that commensurate with those restrictions, that it's implied that there are certain protections that are being protected by due process. After all, why would we have due process if there weren't something we were protecting? Well, what are we protecting? Well, we're basically protecting this area around the individual that belongs to the individual and is a place that government should not interfere. That's where we get the idea of privacy rights, for example. And it is the basis, by the way, for the Loving v. Virginia decision, as well as subsequent decisions that have generated the ire of conservatives, such as the Obergefell versus Hodges decision, which similarly made it illegal for states to ban same-sex marriage. Or, for that matter, the Griswold v. Connecticut decision, which made it illegal for states to ban birth control, which then, of course, led to Roe v. Wade. And this is really what the issue is here. When the anti-abortion activists are attacking Roe v. Wade, they're not just attacking Roe v. Wade. They're attacking the whole legal regime, which has essentially guaranteed people the rights to raise your own children, to marry the person you want, no matter what their race or gender. And if you want to allow states to essentially regulate those things, which really should be personal decisions, and I think most Americans agree should be personal decisions, well, let's start going down that road, which is the road the Supreme Court wants to take us down, and conservatives want to take us down. And that's the admission that Senator Mike Braun stated clearly in his interview. Now, of course, Braun, for his part, is claiming that he didn't understand the question, but I think you can tell pretty clearly from the section of the interview that I played, he knew exactly what he was saying. He just regrets it now. He stepped out of line and said, again, the quiet part out loud. We have another example of that coming from the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings, where our good buddy Lindsey Graham, who at one point was Donald Trump's sworn enemy and best friend to Senator John McCain, and who has turned into perhaps Trump's biggest cheerleader in the U.S. Senate. Well, Lindsey Graham specifically brought up a decision by Ketanji Brown Jackson when she was a district court judge, in which she wrote, and I quote, "Presidents are not kings," which that should be a pretty non-controversial statement in the United States, I would think. But no, not to Lindsey Graham or the other MAGA Trump crowd members. To them, Trump should have been the king, the will of the people notwithstanding. Lindsey Graham in the hearing said, and I quote, "You reached a conclusion because you disagreed with the Trump administration." In other words, as is typical with Donald Trump, if you disagree with Trump, well, you're on the outs and you're wrong. There is no such thing as a civil disagreement over issues with Donald Trump. So we see Graham there arguing once again that the Trump personality cult in the Republican Party is alive and well. Well, if you're concerned about the continuing dominance of the Trump personality cult in the Republican Party, check out this video of mine where I discuss it. That MAGA dominance of the Republican Party might not be such a bad thing. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.